to GMF Face Off, where we discuss one question and two opinions in 30 minutes, this time at a special NATO 2030 edition. My name is Christina Kausch. I'm a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund, and I work here today from Madrid, Spain. Is informality the answer to global crisis management? Is the motion that we're going to discuss today. Before we do so, I would like to bring in you, the audience, and throw you into the cold water and vote right away on this motion. In order to do so, to your right hand, at the bottom of the chat box, you can see the motion pop up next to a little button that says vote. If I may invite you to click that button now, vote yes or no on our motion, so we can see how you stand on this question at the beginning of our debate, while I give a little bit further context. Paraphrasing the Secretary General of the United Nations, multilateral institutions are under fire at a time when we need them most. Now, we do have a lot of global problems that need collective action. These can be structural macro challenges such as climate change or global health, or it can be responses to security flashpoints. All of these need decisive, efficient collective action, which the relevant multilateral institutions are too often unable to provide. Now, there's many reasons why institutions can be dysfunctional or unable to deliver to the point they should. Members may be disagreeing, may be lacking consensus. Internal procedures may be outdated. They may be strained by political controversies or in ideological divides, or simply the institution may lack real political clout it needs. Real political clout means or legitimacy. So what to do? The responses to this question usually go into either of these two directions. Number one, prioritize reform. Roll up your sleeves, make them work. Reform these institutions to bring them up to the task. Now, the issue here is this takes time and needs a political consensus that is often not there. Number two, prioritize action. But how to use the prioritize action and do it outside of the institutions, but how to use the flexibility offered by informality, by ad hoc, by the uncoded, to get things done without sidelining the existing institutions? Is there a way that these two things can be wedded in a constructive and pragmatic way? So this is the balancing act that we're going to look at, and where to situate ourselves on this tightrope. That's what we're going to discuss today with the help of our two speakers. Before we do that, and I'll introduce the speakers in a bit, let's have a look at our entry poll, what the audience thinks of on our motion. Can we see the results? Is informality the answer to global crisis management? What does our audience think at the beginning of the session? Well, while our production team comes up with the results, why don't I introduce the speakers? We have today, to our motion, is informality the answer to global crisis management? Yes, says Charles Kupchen, who is a professor at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And no, says Franziska Brandner, who is a member of the German Bundestag, where she is also the spokesperson for European policy. Franziska, Charles, thank you for joining us today. So you know how this was. Let's see if we have the result of the entry poll now. Yes, oh, there it is. It's yes, 45% says yes, informality is the answer to global crisis management, and 55% say no, which is surprisingly even for me at least. Let's see if you can sway anybody. So Each of you, Franziska and Charles, will have 5 minutes to make your entry statement before we go to a little bit of crossfire. There's going to be a counter that runs for 5 minutes. And as soon as that appears, which should appear now, then Charles, your time runs. Now, go.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you today. And, I'm going to start by picking up on a comment that our chairwoman made during the introduction, and that is to say that the existing multilateral institutions might not cut it. They might not deliver the public goods that we need. And that's my view. I believe that formal multilateralism is still critical, that the existing alliance system is a key anchor, that the liberal international system that has evolved around that alliance system remains critical to ordering the world, and that the global institutions like the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, other bodies of that nature remain key forums. If they didn't exist today, we would have to create them. But they are not enough. How do we know that they're not enough? Because we see today a growing gap between the demand for global governance and the supply of global governance. And as our chairwoman appropriately said, part of the problem is that oftentimes the multilateral institutions, because of their formality, don't find consensus. They're unable to act. In the UN, the great powers veto each other. In NATO, Turkey disagrees with Greece. The Central Europeans disagree with the Western Europeans. And so there is a situation where we don't get the kind of production of public goods that we would like because of the differences of opinion. And so my own view, and I recently published an article with Richard Haas, my colleague at the Council on Foreign Relations, our view is that we need to have alongside the existing infrastructure, a set of more informal institutions that foster strategic dialogue, that put at the table the key states that need to be there, with no procedural formality, with no sense that if you're a democracy, you're in, if you're not a democracy, you're out. We need informal groupings to complement and augment the existing international infrastructure. These bodies would be consultative, not decisional. They would turn to the UN, the WHO, other bodies as needed, but they are critical to finding a way of addressing the shortfall in global governance that we see today. And I would end my introduction with a simple question, and that is, if a spaceship came down from Mars and said, what kinds of systems of governance make sense on this planet? I think the answer would be, well, we should see China and Russia and the EU and the United States and India and other key players sitting down at the table on a daily basis to discuss the big issues of the day, the pandemic, climate change, extremism, nuclear proliferation. That's not happening. Joe Biden is going to sit down with Vladimir Putin in a couple of days, and it represents a rare instance of US cooperation with Russia. That doesn't make any sense to me, but it is a consequence of the existing infrastructure. Let me make a few quick points about why I take this position, and then I will turn it over to my friend, Franziska. One, we're headed into a world that is going to be a mix of bipolar and multipolar. Bipolar because you'll have two full service superpowers, the US and China. Multipolar because there will be other key actors. We're not going back to a decoupled world. The world is too integrated. It is irreversibly integrated and globalized. And as a consequence, we need to figure out how to govern in a globalized world that is multipolar. Two, ideological convergence not happening in a consequential time frame. I think it's safe to say that Russia and China will be illiberal countries, at least for the next few decades. Three, we see, as I said, a growing gap between the supply and demand for global governance. We see a host of new issues: cybersecurity, global health, tech, and regulation of tech that are simply falling through the institutional cracks. The fourth comment, we see that there is a liberal order that exists, and I'm a big fan of it, but it is stumbling. We don't know about its future. It is not likely to be globalized as we expected a few decades ago or even a few years ago. I'm a big fan of that international order. I think the liberal democracy of the world should double down on it. But let's be honest with ourselves. It is not going to serve as the anchor of the global order in the way that we expected. We therefore need to find a way of stimulating discussion, dialogue, conversation across ideological dividing lines. We need new informal institutions to do that. So to sum up.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll leave it here, because your time is over. Thank you,
Okay.
Charles, for this very succinct introduction. Franziska, 5 minutes go to you. The clock runs now.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And as Charles also argued along the lines of its complementarity, it's not either or. Like, you don't want to give up on the informal, on the formal institutions we have. I would also say, for me, it's not a complete either or. So I'm not going to argue against informal exchanges and networks that, by the way, exist, of course, in all the formal institutions. There is no UN without informal conversations and back channels, etc. But I would like to make 2 points in favor of formal institutions and why it's worthwhile investing in them and strengthening them. First, we have seen in the pandemic, in the crisis, how important it is to have institutions that have knowledge and skills and people that we all do rely on and can share and build on. Even if governments do not necessarily agree with everything they do produce, or do not even talk to each other or have suspicions towards each others, it's important to have these institutions. And I think we have seen this with the WHO, and it was rather a mistake of governments in the past to underfund it and not to fund it sufficiently to be better prepared, even better prepared for the crisis. But I think it's good that we had the WHO in this pandemic. And I wish leaders would have taken it more seriously in the last years, because you need these channels of information, production, exchange of information, and then policy decisions based on these. And also, we have seen in the pandemic that it's important to have the formal setups then out of these institutions, of initiatives then that spring out of these institutions, but do still link up, like the global COVAX, etc. They do come from formal settings, offer the opportunity for some to take an initiative, but it's always linked back and stays still in the overall framework of the formal organization, which allows all to participate that want and still have the link and the transparency about what's going on. And that leads me to my second point. I really think that in the provision of global public goods, we need formal agreements, and we need verification thereof, and we need a formal transparency about who is adhering to them and who is not. And in order to, first of all, get to these formal agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement, you need to have all at the table that you need to solve the problem and all those that can spoil it. But you need to have all of them because it's a global question. It concerns the people living in Fiji, in Hawaii, in Poland, in every part of the world. It's only possible to really do it in a global approach if you have everybody around a table. And it's difficult, but you won't get to climate protection without China, without the difficult actors. But you won't also get there if you don't have the perspective of the Fiji Islands that I'd probably in a power balance nobody would really care of. But there are people living who are especially concerned by climate change. So I think it's important to have the spaces where everybody brings their voices and perspectives to, and also they're part of the solution, and then where you can afterwards track, verify, and shame and blame when necessary if people or countries do not follow up on their promises that they have made under international agreements. So you need these formal rooms, and I think we shouldn't belittle them You have been only talking about the Security Council, which has been, yes, less than effective over the last couple of years, Charles. But the United Nations is so much more. It's the Paris Climate Agreement. You have the WHO. You have, there are so many more. And I think that we need rather to really invest time and energy in strengthening them, reforming when necessary. It's obvious that the Security Council should look different. But this doesn't lead me to saying, go all for informality and just invest there your time and energy. Because in the end, I think we need more global public goods. That's the big challenge. Digital safety, climate safety. These are challenges that we cannot really tackle alone. And I think that sometimes smaller countries, even though they're on paper not that important, still can make a difference. So I think inclusion, transparency, and follow-up accountability are important, and you don't get this via informal networks.
Thank you so much for you both of these initial statements, which were very interesting, despite the fact that you did not actually argue against each other. So let me pick on some points to make you so. Let's see. So we have agreement that the executive institutions are not to be done away with, but that the informal and the formal is complementary. So far, so good. Now, Charles, Franziska mentioned the point of inclusivity. I think she said, we need to get everybody around a table. Your proposal basically suggests a kind of global oligarchy, as far as I understand, of the powerful around a table with very little participation from the non-powerful, right? So how would you ensure real inclusivity? And I'm not talking about regional organization representative, about really making sure that everybody, also the weak ones, are represented.
Well, in my own mind, I have a vision that is quite flexible in the sense that I don't see there being one institution that we need. We need lots of small groups. And that's partly what we have, right? Why is it that we see the Normandy grouping, the six-party talks, the contact group, right? The Astana grouping? It's because we need to put together small groups that are able to try to forge agreement on certain issues. In the piece that I mentioned earlier, we did talk about a global steering group, a global concert, because it seems there needs to be some chapeau, some umbrella under which this all occurs. But I do think that in many respects, Franziska and I converge, and I would just end with picking up on her point about the climate agreement. I see that as informal. Yes, it occurred under the auspices of the UN, but there are no signed agreements. There's no enforcement mechanism. And that's in part because we now live in a world where it's very difficult to get our publics and our Congresses to ratify formality. You're going to have a very hard time getting 2/3 of the US Senate to pass a treaty. That's why, in the end of the day, whether it's the Iran deal, the Paris Climate Agreement, other approaches, the United States prefers informality. In some ways, it doesn't have a choice for political reasons.
Right, so formality as a kind of a fluid concept. Let me see, Franziska. So I take your point on what you say, okay, in things like, the UN is actually, apart from in global security, actually the UN is much better than its reputation and is actually doing great work on many fronts. But for example, you yourself are mentioning the deadlock of the Security Council. So what is your proposal? How can global security hotspots be tackled collectively by bringing all the important actors around a table, if not through the Security Council? What is your alternative suggestion?
Allow me to just answer to Charles. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty. So to call that informal, for me, if you call that informal, then what is not informal? But it's a legally binding treaty. So I would
think
say.
Charles was referring to the process, not to the final document. Is that right, Charles?
Well, some of both. If it's a legally binding treaty, it would require Senate ratification, 2/3 of the Senate. So it's more of an executive agreement.
Let's focus. Let's not get hooked up on the legal side of this. Franziska, I'd really like to come back to the core of this.
I get back to your question, because we could get down into legal, now legality.
Yes,
I think it's more a question of how you address it in the US. But, on your point in terms of, if you have a conflict in Syria and Security Council is blocked, what do you do? I guess that's what you hinted at. And that's, of course, when you can try to go via the General Assembly, which hasn't been used in many times. For example, the delivery of humanitarian aid into Syria, the border crossing mechanisms, it will come up now again. I think if Russia and China block again the help going into Syria, it should be brought into the General Assembly and see if there's really a majority voting for letting people starve inside Syria. So, it hasn't been tested and used in many, many years, but it's an option. And I think, for example, on that question, it could be one where I think one could also bring it into the General Assembly. Like for Syria, the mechanism that collected evidence went then into the General Assembly, where it was adopted, which had been impossible in the Security Council, and is an important mechanism for documenting the crimes against humanity that happen in Syria for years now. And I hope that one day they will bring it to in court, the atrocities and hold people accountable to it, as we have seen now with last week, Mladic, etc. Sometimes it takes years, but at least we were able to set up that mechanism in the General Assembly. So that's one part of the answer. It's not used so many times, but it's one venue. Then
let me just throw this back to Charles. So delivery of humanitarian aid, Charles, does that answer satisfy you? I mean,
I said it's one part of the answer. I just
yes. Be short, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry. And then the second part is, of course, that you need regional arrangements that you talk to and talk with. Mm-hmm. For example, on the African continent, African Union, ECOWAS, it depends on the conflict. I think they have great capacity. And if you let them out, it usually doesn't help the situation on the ground. You can set up conferences. You can send an envoy of the UN and then hold conferences. But of course, that needs to be complemented. And there, I agree with informal dialogues, back channeling, all the informal diplomacy that's going on, mediation, etc. So that, of course, peace never happens just because 4 people are sitting, somewhere. It's a process. And part of that process is informal. There, I would agree. But it's often spinning off institutional setups, be they regional or international.
Thank you, Charles. So as Franziska was hinting at, there are legal channels that can also allow for a collective or sort of ad hoc security responses in crisis. So include and also deliver international aid. In Africa and G5 Sahel, for example, is an example of this, where there's an ad hoc solution that is under international law. So, Charles, is this other legal channels that exist under international law for these ad hoc groupings in international security enough? Is your proposal? How does your proposal fit in?
Everything else being equal, I would prefer to reform the UN. I would prefer to have new members in the Security Council. I would prefer to get rid of the veto. I'm a big fan of a kind of formal, legally based approach, but I am also very skeptical that it's going to happen. We've been trying to reform the UN Security Council for decades, and my lips are blue from holding my breath. And as a consequence, I say, okay, then what we need to do is find a way of working around these institutions. They play an important role, but precisely on the delivery of aid to Syria, it's probably better and more effective to create a small group that includes Turkey, the United States, Russia, maybe Iran, and sit down and say, how are we going to do this? Because in the UN Security Council, these procedures are vetoed by the members. So we're going to have to find informal ways of getting to yes.
Yes. Okay. Just 1 second, Franziska, please. 1 second. Before we have another couple of minutes to discuss, and I will give you the floor right away. Before that, let me just launch a second time the polling, please, to the audience. Let's see if any of these short interventions have been able to convince you. Can I ask you, please, to vote again at the bottom of your chat box on the right hand, to vote yes or no, is informality the answer to global crisis management? And we'll compare the entry and exit polls eventually. Franziska, so you both have an opportunity to ask direct questions or to come back to each other on any of the points you have made, perhaps do a final wrap up very briefly. Franziska.
No, I just wanted to say that if there was an informal agreement possible, I think it would have been found if there was willingness for it, Charles. I'm like, they don't want to have that aid to be delivered cross-border. They want to have it under the control of Russia and Assad. That's why they're vetoing it. And if it was that you could just sit at a table and you would find an agreement and it would work, I think everybody would take that agreement. So in that sense, I think in that scenario, the informal one doesn't help. And the question is how you can add pressure to it so that it works and you create other venues. And I really just want to make that point again about the global knowledge production that we need, that is sort of recognized mutually, that we need to build on, be it the IPCC report, the WHO reports, etc. I really think that if you want to solve global problems, that we have some foundation of joint knowledge in that time when knowledge is so much under attack is of incredible value, and for me worthwhile strengthening the institutions.
Great. Charles, let me just throw that finally back to you. So basically what Franziska said is sitting around a table alone doesn't solve the problem. What would you say to that?
I mean, Franziska's right? If that were the case, then peace would break out and we could end this session and all go have a glass of wine. But the problem is that our world is headed into a dangerous moment, right? We're headed in towards multipolarity, globalized interdependence. We've never been here before, right? Since globalization set in, we've had it sort of anchored by a set of more liberal democratic countries. Not so moving forward. And so my bottom line is simply this. Today, when we face unbelievable challenges from pandemics, from climate change, from issues of nuclear proliferation, whatever it is, on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, the key countries of the world should be sitting down and talking to each other in a free-flowing fashion. Are they going to solve today's problem? Am I confident of that? No. Is it better than not having that conversation? Yes.
Thank you, Charles. And I don't know if you two can see this, but we've just got the exit poll, and Charles, you have managed to sway 10%. So now, is informality the answer to global crisis management? The entry poll was yes 45 and no 55, and now we have yes 55 and no 45.
Well, so my conclusion is that it's 50-50. So,
yeah. Well, I think you did both very well, and let me thank you very much. And with that, thank you very much for your contributions. With that, I give back to Brussels. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.